Hello everyone and welcome to review number 1. In this first review, I'll connect and contextualize the course materials by revisiting key issues from our 4 main sources: the assigned readings, lectures, case studies, and slides. I'll link the covered topics to each other and place them within the broader framework of the course. I'll also address some common misconceptions, touch on some slides the videos don't cover, and in a follow-up video discuss statistics to interpret them for a better sense of the facts on the ground. By doing so, I hope to ensure that everyone understands the material and connects its different facets to see the broader context. That's actually a good way to approach any course. Whenever you enroll in a course or consider enrolling in one, it's helpful to spend some time on the syllabus to see how the weekly topics link to each other. That's probably one of the quickest ways to make sense of any course. After all, these individual weekly sessions outlined in the syllabus collectively form one course, often with strong links and some overlaps. You might even upload the syllabus to an AI tool and let it help you see how individual topics connect. You may consider also asking a number of questions. Why were these weekly topics chosen over others? How do they link to one another? What areas do they cover as a whole? And why were these specific areas chosen as topics worthy of discussion? This is especially useful in a course like this one, where the issues are complex, multifaceted, and global. There are huge differences, not only between the countries we cover, but also within them. Global issues are multifaceted and interdisciplinary. There are vast cultural and political differences across contexts, so it's easy to overlook key nuances or misunderstand the facts from time to time. There's also the complexity of life in general and how things may operate differently beneath the surface, so even educated people can often act on inadequate information. For example, when covering the tea industry, I mentioned certifications like fair trade and organic. Though well-intentioned, even those can be misleading as they sometimes benefit large corporations rather than the vulnerable people in the tea or coffee industry. Another misconception I highlighted was about within-country differences, which are often invisible to outsiders who end up homogenizing entire populations and inadvertently favoring those already privileged. Generally speaking, people's awareness levels vary. Some remain ignorant or indifferent, while others who genuinely want to do good may look for certifications or ethical practices without fully realizing how rigged the system can be. One way to navigate these complexities is to stay current, as what's correct today can become inadequate tomorrow. In this course, as in many others, we begin with the basics and the historical context, especially colonial history, to show how the globe as it is today came to be, along with the global issues we've been tackling. We cover various cases to better understand the facts on the ground, or rather, different facts on the ground in different parts of the globe, and then see what patterns emerge and how different topics link to each other. Let me demonstrate this briefly by focusing on a case we'll cover in week 8. It's the week we'll discuss global production networks, and the case is the 2013 Rana Plaza collapse in Bangladesh, where an 8-story building collapsed, killing over 1,100 people. At the time, the collapse attracted significant local and international attention because the unsafe building housed garment factories that produced clothes for well-known brands. Most of those killed were young women earning less than $2 a day. The disaster was likely a long time coming, as extra floors had been added to the building illegally and improperly, and heavy machinery was placed on them. The day before the collapse, people actually noticed huge cracks in the walls, Some factory bosses allowed their workers to stay home, but others, facing order deadlines, did not, ultimately leading to the deaths of their employees. This case is a good example for discussing global production networks because it highlights how global supply chains are interconnected and how poor labor conditions in developing countries help keep prices low in developed ones. But think about how it links to other weekly topics. In the very first week, we asked who makes our products and where. That's a direct connection. The case also ties into the topic of global cities, which we'll cover soon. On the one hand, we have global cities at the core of the global economy, like New York and London. And on the other, we have global cities in the periphery. These are also big cities. Millions of people live there, and they're key to the global economy, but they're located in the periphery. Take Dhaka, Bangladesh. It's a mega city with over 10 million people, but it's a poor city in the periphery. Rana Plaza was located at its outskirts. And what other weekly topics does this case relate to? Labor regimes, definitely. Informal economy, sure. And probably uneven development and a few others. Because real-world cases rarely fit into a single isolated category only. We use these categories for simplicity and practical reasons, but there are often overlaps, and these overlaps are usually significant. But the point remains, cases provide real-world information, making it easier to understand abstract ideas and connect them for a more comprehensive picture. To illustrate this further, let's look at another example, the Bengal Famine of 1770 in British India. It was one of the worst famines in history, killing around 10 million people. That was about 1/3 of Bengal's population at the time. The famine began with a severe drought that devastated food production. However, British colonial policies exacerbated the disaster, turning it into a profound human tragedy. To better understand what went on, at the time, the British had full control over Bengal's economy and had imposed taxes on farmers. These were land-based taxes that had to be paid regardless of the success or failure of crops. Why? Because the British sought a steady income to fund their military presence and administrative affairs in India. So that's how they operated. Even during the drought, farmers were forced to pay these taxes and leaving them with few means to survive. Making matters worse, the British compelled farmers to grow cash crops like indigo and opium, primarily for export. These crops were lucrative but took away land that could have been used to grow food such as rice. Additionally, the British continued to export grain that the local population desperately needed to survive. During the famine, there was almost no assistance for the affected people. The British strictly enforced tax collection and refused to lower grain prices. This combination of drought, harsh taxes, forced cash crop farming, grain exports, and lack of grief altogether transformed a drought into a catastrophic human tragedy. The impact of the famine did not end when the drought subsided. Millions of survivors faced long-term health problems, weakened immune systems, and increased vulnerability to diseases. Psychological trauma was also widespread, leading to a prolonged collapse for entire communities. The region experienced depopulation, economic collapse, and significant declines in the agricultural sector. This famine is just one example. History is filled with similar tragedies. Examining a single event provides only a partial understanding. However, when we study multiple cases across different centuries, regions, and colonial empires, patterns begin to emerge. Certain policies repeat across empires and time periods, while others shift due to changes in the ruling empire or the specific region under control. For instance, comparing colonial rule in the 1700s, 1800s, and 1900s reveals how strategies evolved from early economic control to full-scale territorial administration. Similarly, studying how Britain governed India versus parts of Africa highlights internal differences within a single colonial power. Even within one colony, policies changed over time. British rule in India in the early 1800s differed significantly from that in the late 1800s. By comparing cases across time and place, we gain more than just an understanding of what happened in one location. We learn how colonialism functioned in diverse ways under different rulers and conditions. This approach allows us to move from isolated stories to a broader, more comprehensive understanding of the colonial centuries and the global legacy they left behind. Next, let's take a look at the world we inherited. Arguably, this is a world that consists of a wealthy north and a poor south. This division was suggested in the 1980s by a German politician, and that line on the map, which divides the world in two, was featured in his report. Today, it's quite a different world, and we have more nuanced maps to consider. But first, another map that's far from ideal. In fact, although it's current, this one is only slightly different from the first map. It's by the UN, so it's development-oriented, based on their broad geographic and economic criteria. So on this map, the global north refers to the developed regions of the world. The entire Western world is included in the global north: Europe, North America, Australia, and New Zealand, along with overseas territories like French Guiana in South America. Outside the Western world, Japan, South Korea, and Israel are also included. Next, the IMF classifies countries based on economic criteria. So on this map, we're talking about advanced economies, emerging markets, and low-income developing countries. The IMF does not explicitly use the term global north, but this concept is often used to describe high-income, post-industrial economies with stable financial markets and strong political institutions that uphold the rule of law. These are the countries whose stock exchanges you often hear mentioned in the news, such as the Tokyo Nikkei or the Frankfurt DAX. These economies are indeed at the core of the global economic system. It's also worth noting that many of these economies are part of the NATO alliance or closely aligned with it, though the overlap is not perfect. Also, we no longer see post-communist Eastern Europe in blue here. We don't even have post-communist EU members like Bulgaria or Romania. However, we do have the four Asian tigers: Singapore, South Korea, Hong Kong, and Taiwan, as well as Macau. And finally, we have the map by World Bank. This map significantly overlaps with the first two maps, but includes, in addition, high-income countries that don't satisfy the IMF's economic and political criteria. The criterion here is about 14,000 US dollars per capita income. Because it's based on per capita income, we see Russia back in blue here. This criterion also introduces wealthy rentier states in the Middle East, along with a few others like the Bahamas and Brunei. This third map also gives us an idea about what the global north might mean. But it's not as though one of these maps illustrates the global north correctly and the others incorrectly. These are different maps created using different criteria from three international institutions with three different but overlapping meanings. Therefore, what matters more is being able to understand each meaning with its nuance. In all, definitions and perceptions vary, but still the global north corresponds more or less to countries that are developed, wealthy, secure, and stable both politically and economically. Should Russia be included in the global north? Again, it depends on how you define the global north in your analysis. Regardless, when making this decision, you probably need to remember that Russia is a former empire, so not colonized, but colonizer. It was a former superpower, remains a nuclear power, has infrastructure, well-functioning cities, and a civilization with influence in the Orthodox world. You almost have to think about these things among others. You have to know the relevant key criteria to consider, or rather what criteria not to miss. What conclusions you reach based on that criteria is a different issue, but there are certain indicators you cannot afford to overlook if you intend to have an encompassing view. The same question applies to China. Should it be considered part of the global north today, now that its technology, wealth, stability, security, and infrastructure have all been on par with the best in the world for quite some years? Or should we rather consider China the leader of the global south? Think about what that differentiation means. It may be more consequential than we realize at this moment. But regardless, it probably goes without saying at this point that any analysis on the global level in the 2020s that still overlooks China is likely severely incomplete. So with all that in mind, let's turn to the global south, which is sort of the mirror image of the global north. Because the more we learn about the global north, the more we learn about what the global south is not. So it may be a good idea to start with the least developed countries, or LDCs, designated with red color on the map. LDC is an actual category created by the United Nations decades ago to identify countries that face the most severe development challenges. There were 25 countries on the list when it was first released in 1971. Today, there are 44 countries on that list, not because some countries deindustrialized or anything. The number of countries on the list increased because the criteria have been refined and applied more systematically over the years. As a result, more countries met the new thresholds. Also, several of the 44 countries on the list didn't exist at the time of the first release. Djibouti, for example, gained independence from France in 1977, one of the latest countries to gain independence from a colonial empire during the decolonization wave after World War II. Another example would be Tuvalu, which gained independence from the United Kingdom as late as 1986. That's the small island nation in the Pacific where the only airport, or rather multi-purpose landing strip, is a place where kids play football and community activities are held. I watched that Durbinsky video on it if you haven't already. I'll include a link in the description. But here's a closer look at these 44 countries with their names and locations. The list was recently updated and you have the most up-to-date numbers on this map. 32 of these 44 countries are in Africa, which is perhaps not all too surprising at this point after the lecture section on Scramble for Africa. And Haiti is the only nation on the list from the Caribbean, which too is perhaps not too surprising after the lecture section on Haiti, especially if you watch the comparative real-life lore video with the neighboring Dominican Republic, whom Haiti shares the island with. I hope you watched it. 15 countries are expected to graduate to developing country status in the next couple of years or so. Yes, that's how they classified it. At the bottom are LDCs, and if you graduate from that, you become a developing country. So unless anything unexpected happens, we will have roughly 29 LDCs soon. And 25 of them will be from Africa. 25 out of 29, give or take. Only 3 from Asia, and only 1 from the Caribbean. Yes, Haiti will remain on the list, probably for quite some time, given its current situation. But the point is, 25 out of the 29 LDCs, give or take, will be in Africa. By the way, I think if you travel to these 29 countries, that's when you really see the world. That's not an exaggeration because there's still a notable difference between these 15 LDCs that are expected to graduate soon and those who will remain on the list. Moreover, there's a bottom layer of that bottom layer as well, meaning Some of these 29 countries have it the worst. These are mostly countries in Central Africa that face extreme levels of poverty. We are often largely blind to these variations due to our lack of knowledge about Africa and our frequent failure to differentiate between different concepts. Let me put it this way. The UN uses three main criteria to come up with a list of least developed countries. Income per capita is one. Overall economic vulnerability is another. Availability of human resources like nutrition and education is the third criterion, but these are separate concepts. Let's look at this map, for example. It's the global map of extreme poverty, and you see the colors get dense in certain regions of the global south once again. Or this map of life expectancy. Two things at this point. First, these maps demonstrate significant variation in Africa. And second, concepts like poverty, instability, and security convey different meanings. You can actually live a pretty good life in Nairobi, Kenya, if you have the means to do so, especially in a rich neighborhood like Westlands, Nairobi, with all its luxury cafes, eateries, and everything. All that is to say that we have to think about the global south in layers, and that LDCs are a subset of the global south, and they supposedly constitute the bottom layer of the global south, but there's variation even at that bottom layer. And the whole point is that variation. There's significant variation in Africa. Here's another map to illustrate this. It's the travel advisory from the Australian government, and I'd say it's quite accurate. I'd even add that it's a bit conservative, as you can quite comfortably travel in not only the green but also the yellow parts on the map. It's a common misconception in the West and other places to consider the whole continent as part of that bottom layer. What matters instead is to educate ourselves on these issues regarding the variations in Africa and grow a trained eye to more accurately understand Africa or the global south or the world. For example, if you look at the eastern parts of DR Congo, bordering Rwanda, you'll see that it's in red. That's where the ongoing problem you may have heard on the news this past week involving Rwandan-backed militias is taking place. The events have led to the displacement of almost 500,000 people and counting, although not a lot of people are paying attention to it. Just one example. In closing, I'll turn to the leaders of the Global South. I intend to do this in an effort to highlight the vast variation that exists within the Global South. What's between the top and bottom layers of the Global South actually represents a significant portion of the world's population, as well as its land surface. This middle layer is often referred to as the developing world, but it is pretty much the world. By characterizing the bottom and top layers of the Global South, I want to demonstrate how significant the variation within the Global South is. Perhaps this will also imply that it's problematic to conflate all of these countries together and paint them all with the same brush on the world map. So on this slide, you have both the bottom layer countries and the top layer countries, but not really any countries in between. The first to mention at this point is perhaps BRICS. As I've taught about the developing world and the global south over the years, I have found myself talking more and more about BRICS as it has continued to emerge as a major bloc, offering an alternative to the global north or the G7. Membership in BRICS includes key players such as China, Russia, India, Brazil, South Africa, and more recently has expanded to include Indonesia and others. Together, these countries already represent about half of the planet's population. Besides BRICS, the IMF has its emerging markets classification, and the World Bank has its upper middle income countries classification to refer to the top layer. The 11 NICs, or newly industrialized countries classification has also been around for a while. And I see these are the countries that are most likely to follow the four Asian tigers in achieving development, and China has been the most successful among them by far. So, this is a rough summary of the world as it is in 2025, and I will stop here. Although there's a lot more to talk about, I will leave those topics for the follow up video.